My grandparents secretly left me everything and told me to say nothing. I kept that secret for 2 years. Then I found the letter, and the truth burned my entire family to the ground. My grandfather had a saying he repeated so often that it became the wallpaper of my childhood. Something so constant you stopped seeing it until the day you needed it most. He used to say, "The fish that opens its mouth before the water is right will never reach the sea." He was a quiet man, a deliberate man, the kind of person who thought about what he was going to say for so long that by the time he said it you understood, instinctively, that every word had been chosen. He'd spent 40 years as a machinist and then another 20 running his own small manufacturing operation, and he approached everything in his life the way he approached a piece of raw material. Patiently, precisely, with a long view of what it was eventually meant to become. My grandmother was different in temperament, warmer, quicker to laugh, the emotional center of every room she entered. But in the matter of patience and long planning, they were the same. They had built their life together with a precision and care that I came to understand, only after they were gone, had been directed not just at their finances but at the particular problem of their family. Their family, which is also my family, is a complicated structure. My grandfather was one of 5 siblings, all of whom had children, most of whom had opinions, and none of whom had ever fully resolved the question of who in the family deserved what. My mother is their eldest child. Then comes my Uncle Gerald, who is 2 years younger and who has spent most of his adult life in a posture of grievance that I used to think was about specific things and now understand is just how he is. Then Aunt Phyllis, the middle child, who is warm and capable and who has spent decades trying to be the family's peacemaker and who has paid a considerable personal cost for that effort. My grandparents had 2 other children who died young, one before I was born, one when I was 4. And those losses shaped my grandparents in ways I am still only partially able to see. I am 29 years old. I was their first grandchild. And 2 years ago, at a meeting with their estate attorney 6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, I found out that they had left me, specifically and exclusively, nearly everything they had. What followed was the most difficult, clarifying, and ultimately transformative period of my life. I want to tell you first about who they were to me, because the inheritance is not the point. I know that sounds strange given what the inheritance eventually set in motion, but the money was never the point. The people were the point. They always were. I spent more time with my grandparents than any other grandchild, partly because my mother is the eldest and lived closest, and partly because from a very young age I had a rapport with them that I couldn't fully explain then and can only partially explain now. I used to go to their house after school starting when I was 8, let myself in with the key they'd given me, do my homework at the kitchen table while my grandmother cooked, and then sit with my grandfather after dinner and listen to him talk about whatever was on his mind. Not children's topics. Real topics. History, manufacturing, the business, the neighborhood when he'd been growing up in it. He talked to me like a person, not a grandchild who needed to be managed. I think that was the beginning of something between us that was distinct from what he had with the others. As I got older, I started helping with the business in small ways. Summers through high school, more seriously in college, and then after I graduated with a business degree, I spent 2 years working alongside him before his health declined enough that they needed to scale things down. I watched how he ran things. I watched how he made decisions. I watched how he thought about money, not as a destination but as a tool, something to be handled with respect and applied with intention. I learned more in those 2 years than in 4 years of school, and I loved him for it with the uncomplicated fierceness that you feel toward the people who actually teach you how to be in the world. My grandmother gave me different things. She gave me the language of the family's history, the stories, the photographs, the names and dates and relationships, the sense of where we'd come from and what it had cost. She was the one who told me about the children they'd lost, something that was not spoken about in the family at large. And she told me carefully and fully because she believed that the truth of a family had to live somewhere and she decided it was going to live with me. I didn't understand the weight of that at the time. I do now. My grandfather died 18 months before my grandmother. At his funeral, Gerald gave a eulogy that managed, with some skill, to be mostly about Gerald. Phyllis held my mother's hand and mine alternately for most of the service. The extended family came in from 3 states and filled the church and ate everything at the reception and left, and my grandmother sat in her chair by the window afterward with the particular stillness of someone who has just watched the scaffolding of their life be carried out. She lived alone for those 18 months. I visited twice a week without fail. I took her to her appointments. I helped her navigate the things my grandfather had always handled and that she was now learning for the first time. Gerald came by infrequently and always, when he did come, managed to turn the visit toward some discussion of finances or the business or what was going to happen with the house. Phyllis called regularly but lived too far to visit often. My mother was present and steady. My grandmother told me, in one of our last clear conversations before she began to decline, that she was not afraid of dying and that there was nothing left undone. She said she and my grandfather had done what they needed to do and that things had been arranged properly and that I would understand eventually. I thought she was talking about coming to terms with mortality. I didn't understand that she was telling me something specific. She died on a Tuesday morning in March. I was with her. 6 weeks after the funeral, I sat in the office of an estate attorney named Mr. Osei, a careful, gentle, extremely precise man who had been my grandparents' attorney for over 20 years, and I listened to him explain the contents of their estate plan, the house, the remaining business assets and accounts, a portfolio of investments that my grandfather had been quietly building for 30 years and which had grown, through patience and compound interest and the kind of long-view thinking that was simply how he operated, to a figure that I did not expect. Several smaller items distributed to specific people, a watch to a friend, jewelry to my mother and Phyllis, a particular chair my grandfather had loved to a neighbor who'd always admired it. And then the rest, the substantial rest, the entirety of the financial estate, to me. No portion to Gerald. No portion to any of the extended family. A modest amount to a charitable organization they'd supported for decades. Everything else me. Mr. Osei handed me an envelope as the meeting was ending. He said my grandmother had given it to him with specific instructions that it be given to me alone, that I read it privately, and that I was not required to share its contents with anyone. He said she had asked him to tell me to wait until I felt I needed it, and that I would know when that was. I put the envelope in my bag. I drove home. I placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. I did not open it. Not that day. Not for a long time. I had been asked, by Mr. Osei and in accordance with my grandparents' explicit wishes, to keep the specifics of the estate private until the process was legally complete, a period of several months. I honored that. I kept the existence of the will unremarkable, said only that things were being sorted through the attorney, deflected questions about the house and the business with the truth that everything was still being processed. Gerald, predictably, did not wait for things to be processed. Within 3 weeks of the funeral, he had called me twice, my mother once, and Phyllis twice to discuss what he referred to as the situation with the estate. Meaning, with no subtlety at all, what he expected to receive and when. He had a number in his head. He had apparently had a number in his head for a while. He spoke about my grandparents' assets with a familiarity and specificity that I noted but didn't yet fully understand. When the estate was formally settled and my inheritance became a matter of legal record, which in our state is public for probate purposes, Gerald found out within a week. I don't know how. I know that he knew before I called anyone in the family, which meant he had either been monitoring the probate filings or someone had told him, and either option tells you something about the level of attention he had been paying. He called me on a Wednesday evening and the call lasted 40 minutes, which I know because I looked at my phone when it ended and noted the time with a kind of stunned disbelief. He said I had manipulated them, that I had been positioning myself for years, playing the devoted grandchild to work my way into their favor, that a fair reading of the family's history would have distributed the estate among all their children equally, and that by accepting this inheritance I was participating in an injustice to his family. He said the word manipulated several times. He said it with a specificity that suggested he'd been practicing. Phyllis called 2 days later. Her call was different. More pained than angry, more confused than accusatory. But underneath the gentleness it contained the same basic question. Why me and not them? She said she didn't want to believe the things Gerald was saying. She said she hoped there was an explanation. I heard, in the way she said it, that she was asking me to give her one. My mother called an hour after Phyllis and said, in the voice she uses when she's working very hard to be neutral, that things were going to be complicated for a while, and that she supported me but that I needed to be prepared for the family to be difficult. She said Gerald is who he is, which is her shorthand for a thing she's been saying for 30 years in various forms. What none of them knew, because I had not opened it, was that there was an envelope in my nightstand. I want to tell you about the 2 years that followed, but I want to be honest that they are not a story of dignified silence and graceful handling, because that is not what it was. It was hard. It was the kind of family rupture that gets worse before it stabilizes, that pulls in people who didn't ask to be pulled in, that surfaces old resentments and older wounds and things that everyone agreed by unspoken convention to leave buried. Gerald stopped speaking to me directly and started a campaign of what I can only describe as reputational pressure, conversations at family gatherings, comments to extended relatives, a consistent narrative in which I was the ambitious one who had manipulated 2 elderly people into a windfall while the real family watched. Some relatives believed him. Some didn't. The ones who didn't were largely people who had known my grandparents well enough to understand that they were not people who were manipulated into anything, ever, by anyone. The ones who did believe him were largely people who found Gerald's version of events more comfortable than the alternative, which was that my grandparents had made a considered and deliberate choice that didn't include him. The family gatherings that did happen in those 2 years were tense in the specific way that only families can be tense. Everyone performing normalcy over a structure that everyone knows is cracked. I went to them because my mother asked me to and because I believed, then as now, that absence is a statement too and I wasn't ready to make it. I ate the food and talked about neutral things and watched Gerald across the room and thought about the envelope in my nightstand. I thought about it often. I carried the not having opened it like a low-grade fever, present enough to be noticed, not bad enough to be decisive. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. My grandmother had said I would know. I was trying to trust that. The moment came on a Sunday in October, 26 months after the estate meeting. I had just come back from a family dinner, Phyllis's birthday, one of the tension-saturated ones, where Gerald had said something to a cousin of ours about my grandfather's late-stage mental capacity that I understood immediately was groundwork for a potential challenge to the will. It was calculated and it was quiet and most people in the room probably didn't register it as what it was. I did. I drove home and I sat in my apartment for a while and then I went to the nightstand and I took out the envelope. I opened it. There were 4 pages inside, handwritten in my grandmother's careful, slightly formal script, dated approximately 8 months before her death. I am going to tell you what was in those pages, but I need you to understand that what I am about to describe was not what I expected. I had expected, I think, some version of explanation, why me, why not the others, some accounting of love and trust and the particular relationship I'd had with them. I was not prepared for what was actually there, because what my grandmother had written was not primarily about me. It was about Gerald. She had written it, she explained at the beginning, because she needed there to be a record somewhere of the truth, in case the truth ever became necessary, and because she trusted me to handle it with the same patience and deliberateness she and my grandfather had always tried to exercise. The truth was this. Over a period of approximately 9 years, Gerald had been systematically taking money from my grandparents. Not stealing technically, not in the way that leaves a clear legal trail. More like borrowing that never became repayment, consistently and repeatedly. Loans that were always urgent, always justified by some business opportunity or financial emergency, always accompanied by a detailed plan for repayment that never materialized. My grandparents had given him money 17 times over those 9 years. My grandmother had kept a record, which she'd hidden in a place Gerald had no reason to look, and she included a summary in the letter. The total across those 9 years was just under $200,000. My grandparents had not told anyone. Not my mother. Not Phyllis. Not me. They had continued to loan because Gerald continued to ask and because they were who they were. People who believed in their children and who, my grandmother wrote, kept hoping that one more time would be the one that turned the corner for him. By the time they accepted it wasn't going to turn, too much had already passed hands, and they were too proud and too private to expose one son to the rest of the family. So they had done something else instead. They had restructured. Quietly, carefully, over the final years, they had moved and arranged and planned, with Mr. Osei's help, so that what remained of their estate would not be accessible to the person who had spent a decade treating it as a personal reserve. They did not take it from him with anger. They had simply, with my grandfather's precision and his machinist's eye for exactly where a piece of material needed to be placed to do its job, put it somewhere he could not reach it. They put it with me. My grandmother's letter said, "We did not choose you only because we trust you, though we do. We chose you because you are the only one who will understand why it was done this way without needing us to be the villains of someone else's story. Your grandfather says you have his patience. I believe that is true. Use it. I sat with those 4 pages for a very long time. I want to tell you what I did with that information because I think this is where the story either becomes something useful or just becomes another family horror story, and I have tried very hard for it to be the former. I did not, in the immediate aftermath of reading the letter, do anything. This was the hardest decision, and I believe it was the right one. Gerald's quiet will challenge groundwork had not yet materialized into anything actionable, and moving before it did would have meant showing my hand before the water was right. My grandfather's voice in my head. I waited. 3 weeks later, through the attorney, Gerald's family sent a formal letter raising questions about my grandparents' mental capacity at the time the estate documents were executed and requesting documentation supporting their competency. I called Mr. Osei that afternoon. I told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Are you prepared to respond fully?" I said yes. He said, "Then bring me everything she left you." What followed was a process that I will describe as clean because that is what it was. The letter, combined with the financial records my grandmother had kept, combined with Mr. Osei's own files, which included his contemporaneous notes from every meeting with my grandparents over 20 years, all of which reflected 2 people of clear and consistent mind who knew exactly what they wanted, constructed a response to Gerald's challenge that was comprehensive and documented, and which left almost no room for the challenge to stand. It also, of course, exposed the loans. I did not make the decision to expose them lightly. I understood that doing so would change things permanently. I understood that the family, whatever shape it had managed to hold until now, would not hold the same way after. I talked to my mother before anything was filed. I sat with her for an afternoon and I showed her the letter and I watched her read it and I watched her face move through several things that I am not going to try to describe because they were not mine to describe. She was quiet for a long time when she finished. Then she said, "She kept all of this and never said a word. It wasn't a question. It was just a truth landing somewhere." My mother said she needed time. I gave her time. She called me a week later and said, "Do what they needed you to do." The response to Gerald's challenge was filed. Gerald's attorney, upon receiving the documentation, advised him that proceeding was unlikely to be productive. The challenge was dropped. The estate remained as settled. Gerald has not spoken to me since. I expect he won't for a long time, possibly ever. I've made a kind of peace with that. The man I was grieving when I thought about losing him was a version of an uncle that I now understand was constructed for family consumption, performed with the same practiced ease that Calvin had in the last story, the same gift for being exactly what the room needed him to be until the stakes became high enough that the performance slipped. The grief for the real Gerald is a different and smaller thing, because the real Gerald had been making choices for 30 years that I can now see clearly, and those choices were his. Phyllis knows the truth. She is processing it in the slow, careful way that people process things that restructure their understanding of their own history. We talk more than we used to. She told me recently that she'd had her own small financial interactions with Gerald over the years, much smaller, nothing like what my grandparents had absorbed, and that she'd always chalked them up to bad luck and poor timing. She said seeing the full picture had been like having a pair of glasses put on that she hadn't known she needed. We are building something new between us, Phyllis and my mother and I, something that lives on the other side of what the letter revealed. It is quieter than what the family used to be. It is also more honest. I think my grandmother would have found that acceptable. The house I kept for the first year and then made a decision about that I think was right. I sold it. Not quickly, not casually, not without grief. I walked through every room before the closing and I sat in the kitchen where I'd done my homework as a child and I sat in my grandfather's chair and I thought about all of it for a while. Then I took what it sold for and I put a portion into a fund in memory of both of them, directed at a trade school scholarship in my grandfather's name, because he believed in the dignity of working with your hands and making things that lasted. I kept the rest and I have handled it the way he would have, patiently with a long view, not as a destination but as a tool. My grandmother's letter lives in a fireproof box in my closet. I read it sometimes, not often. When I read it, I hear her voice exactly, the particular cadence of it, the warmth running underneath the formality of her careful script. I hear my grandfather in the precision of what she describes. The way they built the plan, the patience of it, the long view of it, the love underneath all of it that expressed itself not in grand gestures but in the quiet, painstaking work of protecting someone they trusted with the truth. They knew what they were doing. They always knew what they were doing. Here is what I want to say to you wherever you are in something like this. Inherited money does not divide families. I want to be precise about that because I think the popular version of this story, unexpected wealth tears family apart, misses the real mechanism. What money does is remove the insulation. It strips away the comfortable fictions that families maintain because the fictions are easier than the truth, and it replaces them with a stark and unignorable accounting. The division was already there. The secrets were already there. The taking, the resentment, the performance of a person who needed the room to see him a particular way, all of it was already there. The inheritance didn't create any of it. It just made it impossible to keep not seeing. There is a version of this story where I stay quiet, where I keep the letter private, where I absorb Gerald's challenge without showing what I have, where I accept a smaller settlement to preserve peace and avoid exposure and keep the family's shape intact. I thought about that version seriously. There are things to recommend it. It has lower costs in certain ledgers. But my grandfather made something last by being precise about where he put it. My grandmother kept a record because she believed the truth had to live somewhere. They had spent 40 years building something carefully, and they had placed it in my hands specifically because they trusted me to understand that what they built was not just money. It was evidence of a life spent knowing what things were actually worth. I wasn't going to be the one who let that be taken apart by someone who'd been treating their life's work as a personal reserve for 9 years and then dressed it up as a question of fairness. Keep your own records. Know what things are actually worth. And when someone hands you an envelope and says you'll know when to open it, trust that you will. When the water is right, the fish finds the sea.